Old d'Iberville's back in the news, I see. There's a story in the CBC online news for Newfoundland and Labrador mentioning a street name in the town of Carbonear, d'Iberville Street. Pierre Lemoyne d'Iberville is known in some quarters as being a naval hero. He's a French Canadian. In Louisiana, he's known for a lot of things. But in Newfoundland, he's a f***ing monster. If people in other jurisdictions want to hold him up in some kind of high regard, that's not my business at all. But for a street in Carbonear to honor, even though we'll talk about the mayor in a second, the mayor says it wasn't honoring, but to honor a man who murdered hundreds of Newfoundlanders when there was only a couple of thousand Newfoundlanders at most, it's ludicrous to me. It doesn't make any sense. There is a resident of Carbonear right now, Lauren Power, and Lauren, if you're watching this, please know that I have your back on this completely. Lauren Power has a petition going, and I'm not sure if there's any online options to sign the petition, but I hope if there is, somebody can maybe share a link in the chat below. I'm a fairly knowledgeable student of Newfoundland, been reading up and working hard to learn more about the history of Newfoundland in recent years, and until recent years, I didn't know who Iberville was. So I'm willing to bet that many people don't know who he was. I'm talking about him a little bit here on a very high level, some of the terrible things he did in Newfoundland. He started in what's now Placentia with an army at his charge, crossing from Placentia to Ferryland and heading along the coast all the way up to Carbonear, Harbor Grace, that area. He tore apart and burnt to the ground all of the towns or settlements, because there weren't towns back in those days, murdering and trying to wipe out the existence of any people in Newfoundland. He was successful. I mean, he went to Carbonear, and the people of Carbonear couldn't put up much of a resistance, but they were able to stay safe by heading over to Carbonear Island and shoring that off to protect themselves from the fate of everybody else along the army's path. I saw the story on the CBC online for Newfoundland and Labrador. The mayor put in his 2 cents on the story. I mean, I'm not trying to shame anybody. I don't know the mayor of Carbonear, but he said something to the effect of, it's our history, we need to protect our history. And then he invoked the famous Churchill quote, something to the effect of, if you don't remember your history, you're doomed to repeat it, or you're bound to repeat it. True, but by that logic, we can make comparisons and go down very dark roads very quickly. We don't need to do that. We can keep things light and still show how ridiculous this is. For example, I'm a big basketball fan. Do you remember Lebronto? We're not going to actually rename the biggest city in Canada Lebronto, of course, that's crazy. But maybe what we could do is designate a section in the Scotiabank Arena as the Lebronto section. That makes sense, right? That's history. We don't want to forget our history, so we should name a section of the Scotiabank Arena the Lebronto section, right? Sticking with the Toronto sports theme for a second, I actually am not a hockey fan at all, but I know enough. So if the Lebronto analogy doesn't work for you, how about we name that section of Scotiabank Arena the 2013 Boston Bruins Game 7 comeback section? Does that make sense? It is our history. It was painful. It's something we shouldn't forget, or else we might continue to make the same mistakes that were made in that game. But I don't know, maybe not. Let's change things up a little bit here. There's a very significant page in the history of St. John's, where in 1987 or 1988, the premier of the time, Brian Peckford, announced a game changer for the city, for the province, for the country. We were going to grow cucumbers at the Sprung Greenhouse facility. There's a subdivision that was built a couple of years ago that is technically part of the city of St. John's, but is only accessible through Commonwealth Avenue in Mount Pearl, which is another story that I'm not going to get into here because it's too crazy. But why don't we name that subdivision the Sprung subdivision? Or if that's too much, why don't we name one of the streets, even a small one, Sprung Street or Sprung Crescent or Sprung Place? It's a painful part of our history. We can't afford to lose the hard lessons that were learned through the Sprung Greenhouse fiasco of 1988.
I know in my own heart and soul that what we have here is going to work, so it's only a matter of time, and there'll be cucumber over all kinds of people's faces.
We can look to the city on the west coast of Newfoundland for some guidance. It's not like the most prominent building on the west coast of the island of Newfoundland was named after a terrible person.
Are you serious?
The Sir Richard Squires building, don't forget the Sir, is a 12-story building in a small city, and it's actually situated on a little bit of an elevated piece of land, so it really stands out. And it's named after, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many other people, the worst leader, politically speaking, to lead Newfoundland, whether as the Dominion, whether as a province of Canada. This guy is a real piece of work. If you're interested in Newfoundland history, learn more about Richard Squires. The Prime Minister of the Dominion at the time of the country, over two stretches from between 1919 and 1932. The 1932 being very significant because of the dissolution of democracy in Newfoundland. And he played a pretty significant role in coming to that point. Sometimes we hold people up in ways that don't make sense. Sometimes names get stamped on important landmarks because we forget who these people were, or we don't have the whole story, which is not a Newfoundland problem. It's a problem everywhere. Pound for pound, Iberville caused more death and destruction in Newfoundland than anybody else in history. But a lot of time has passed, so people may not know who it is. The stories are there. There's a lot written about him, but when you go back almost 350 years to his time on the island of Newfoundland, somewhat understandable that people are not as familiar with what he did to the island of Newfoundland in those days. Street names can be changed. It's as simple as that. Changing a street name that was designated in 2011 does not erase history. There are other ways that we can share the history and the stories, good and bad, about the people that have stepped foot on Newfoundland and Labrador over the centuries. There are lots of ways that we can remember and share and learn from history. We can change this sign. Sometimes change is okay.